Yes, everybody, welcome back to the Irish Hotspur. Sam filling in for the wonderful Dave Harris, who is still ill, but we've done some pundit reactions for you guys. Hopefully, you do enjoy these. And this one's going to be on Simon Jordan, who was asked about, Ange's recent press conference quotes about how there might be a media agenda driven against him and his Spurs team. And this is what Simon had to say. And I'm also kind of doing some paraphrasing in some of these, to sort of provide the context because it was kind of a long typical, as probably Sam would know, Simon Jordan monologue. He usually likes to answer things in a very long format. And he said, I don't think there's an agenda. I don't think he helps himself, though, with certain sections of the media. He's intolerant of them being the media. He's intolerant of some of their questioning, and he resents it. Simon then goes on to explain that Ange's intolerance to the media is saying that a lot of their questioning can be very pointed towards a gotcha moment by them, and that they can, in fact, try to trip you into something so that they can get a headline out of you, basically, is what his metaphor was. And then he did go on to concede that he doesn't help himself, Ange Postecoglou, by citing the example from last season when we had a lot of goals conceded from set pieces. And Ange went on to say, I'm not interested in set pieces, mate. And he also then went on to say that he says unfortunate things at times that often can open a can of worms on himself. To go to the agenda question, he goes on to say that he makes certain journalists and people want to have a pop at him, but I don't think Ange Postecoglou by any means is being singled out for any particular criticism beyond the fact that his team is just getting beaten on a regular basis. I mean, Sam, I agree with actually some big parts of what Simon has to say here. I have found that, maybe there has been at some points a media agenda against Ange, particularly with the high line. I think that one has always been a bit unfair to him, and you don't really see the same questions, brought to others. But when it comes to this agenda driven against him and his team, I kind of agree with Simon. I think sometimes Ange maybe doesn't necessarily help himself out. And I'll bring up a few examples, but what are your thoughts on, Simon Jordan maybe not being too sympathetic to his man Ange?
I kind of see it two ways, right? I
Yeah.
do agree with a lot of what sort of Simon said, um, but there definitely is a agenda, like in my opinion. Like I think that when Ange came in, he was this breath of fresh air, right? He won three back-to-back player of the manager of the months, and I think that ever since that Chelsea game, when he said I'll play. I mean, and I've said this before, that was probably the biggest mistake he made during his Spurs career was coming out and saying, "If I had five players on the pitch, I'd play the same way, mate." Um, so I agree. He does say things that kind of shoot him in the foot. But I mean, for example, when I don't know if it's the same on American coverage, but when you watch stuff on Sky, um, about let's talk about the set pieces, right? They'll say Spurs are they're terrible at set pieces, blah blah blah, and then the stat will pop up, and they have like a little window at the bottom. The stat will pop up, and it'll be like Spurs have conceded 24 set pieces since the start of last season, and it's like, okay, yes, that is a fact, and we're all I'm reluctant to say happy to admit that, but we'll all accept that, right? But when you actually then look at the facts, it was like we've only conceded like three set pieces this season or something.
Mhm.
I don't know the exact number, but there is always going to be an angle with media stuff, whether it's directed towards Ange or it's directed towards bashing Tottenham. Like I saw this meme that Simon Jordan posted earlier on Twitter. I don't know if you saw it, Jack.
Mhm.
It was basically a list. It was like a photo of Son, like really, like looking really upset, like he's missed a chance, and it basically lists like all the teams that would win trophies if Man City had their titles stripped. And then at the end of it, it says, "But Spurs still won't win a thing," with
I
like
think there's a
crying laugh
community notes
faces.
attached to it. Simon was,
Yeah,
in
there
fact,
is
wrong.
exactly, and he replies like, "Oops, THFC, so unkind," with like a winky tongue out emoji. But then the community note says, "Not true. Tottenham played Man City in 2021 Cup final, and therefore, in this hypothetical situation, Tottenham would win this trophy. And we obviously know that people say we've won nothing, and while that is true in recent years, we have won a lot of trophies in the past. I've not seen any, and we've not seen any, but
Are you kind of
they
saying
are
that people like
there.
to kick us when we're down, in kind of the last decade or two? It's like, oh, Spurs are losing again. No reason to show sympathy. Just talk about, how the manager sucks and, how he's getting this wrong. He's getting this wrong. Typical Spurs, Is that kind of
Yeah,
what you
look,
think?
definitely.
Yeah.
And look, I've been. You could
So that's the
maybe
agenda,
label.
maybe that Ange is talking about,
Exactly.
really.
You could
Yeah.
maybe label some of the same criticism that I'm putting on the media towards myself, because I've said, I've not seen enough from Ange. I've kind of reached the point where I'm swaying more towards him leaving than I am towards him staying.
Hmm.
Um, I'll caveat that with like games like Brentford bring me back in, but then games like Liverpool and Villa, throw me back out.
Right.
Um, but I think that with Ange, you're right. He does say things where you're just like you're giving them the stick to beat you with.
Right.
And I think that under Klopp, I used to think a lot of a lot of the same things about Liverpool. Not necessarily that they were poor enough for the media to be like piling on them, but when it comes to Ange in the media, I would look at Klopp, and Klopp would be snappy with,
Yeah.
journalists, and he'd get in arguments. And I see Ange, and I understand where it's coming from. It's frustration of being asked the same question over and over and over again. Or what was that? Uh, the one of the games we lost the other day. The journalist said like, "So Ange, like familiar story,"
Yeah.
and he just was like, "That's a great way to
Snapped.
start an interview."
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like the thing is, I kind of get that. Like, I would also think you're a see you next Tuesday for like, bombarding me with a loaded comment as your first statement on a live TV interview.
Mhm. But isn't
Um,
this is this and the this is then where kinda Simon's point comes from is, like, who's to say that Ange isn't probably special, though, in this regard? Like, there's been plenty of managers that have probably had to deal with very underhanded comments, by media and have had to deflect it and probably, take the higher road and then end up pretending, as if, they didn't hear it, right, the way that they knew that they heard it, right? Where it's like, "Hmm, what do you really mean by that?" And they've had to sort of deflect it, move on. Ange isn't very good at that. Ange, in my opinion, is in fact a very honest person, almost to the case of what people have spoken about, what can be the case. Sometimes you can be too honest. Sometimes you might end up almost in a way hurting yourself. I think he almost, like he said, opens a cans of worms on himself by being too honest. Because if he were just a bit better at, in a way, what Dave does, what I do sometimes, we'll talk for 2 to 3 minutes, during a watch long or something, and end up actually saying nothing at all. I think Ange would do actually benefit from doing that in some of these lines of questioning and whatnot. So I agree with Simon that they are actually trying to do the gotcha type of stuff. I think that's totally valid. There is clearly been plenty of examples of the media trying to gotcha Ange, trying to get him on something. And that's always been their case. They're trying to look for a headline, they're trying to look for contradictions, they're trying in a way to, in a sense, make you look silly. It's just grabs more headlines, it grabs more clicks, and it's just part of, I think, the game of it, really, because they are listening to you on such a regular basis. They're hanging on to your every word. They are going to see where kind of things don't end up sort of matching up. And I think in Ange's case, since he speaks so honestly, that ends up happening where he'll say something one week and then the next week he'll say something in a way that can be a bit contradictory. But you will look at like the point of the high line, is like a good example of like when there was definitely some sort of media agenda, because the way they spoke about that Chelsea game, it's like a whole different narrative was written about that game, like as if Spurs weren't the better team for pretty much 90 minutes against Chelsea, despite going down to 9 men and all the injuries and everything. We were the better team. We were the team that probably actually still could have gotten something out of that. But the way they sort of spun that around as if Ange was just some sort of lunatic that like lost the game and like, this was the sign of the end and all these things. I think that is a sign of some sort of media agenda there because they completely rewrote, how that game went. If anything, that was more of a reflection of how poor Pochettino's Chelsea team was at the time, that they actually nearly lost to a team that was down to 9 men in that situation, and also got away with the fact that we had all the injuries, the offsides, etc. And also, I will say, like, the deliberate questioning on like his sort of style of play. You'll even like hear the journalists like chuckle amongst themselves, like when they even ask, like, "Oh, are you going to switch things up for this game, Ange?" Like, and then he'll even chuckle back at them. Like, that's such a sign of like some sort of media type agenda that's just kind of so far fetched at this point that they're even like laughing about it, like it's an inside joke or something. So there have been points where I would say he's had this kind of agenda maybe driven against him. Even another example I wrote down was like when he's been gotcha'd before about referees, like, they said like, "Oh, like you said that about VAR the other week." I actually think Ange has been a breath of fresh air when it comes to referees. I think he's actually had a lot of really good takes on things about kind of maybe bringing it back to the old days, making it a bit more simple, allowing people to make mistakes. They're all humans, that type of stuff. But then when he shows one sign of frustration towards a referee, then all of a sudden they were like, Ange, like you just said, leave the referees alone. It's like, come on, man. Like, I think he's been very brave, very open about sort of his opinions on these things. I think he's actually been a breath of fresh air. Where I will go on to where he's hurt himself is on examples like set pieces where he said like, I'm not interested in set pieces. We went on to like concede a lot of set pieces after that, like, and so what ended up happening was they panned the camera towards him and they panned the questions towards him because the moment he said that, we for some reason continued to concede set pieces. So the question was kind of just the elephant in the room, really. So that's a good example of him opening a can of worms on himself, if you will. And also I will say this, like when he said I always win things in my second season, I think that was not that different to when Antonio Conte had said some version of, "Oh, I'm not used to, this situation. I'm not used to this type of, losing, in my career." I don't find that to be that different, from, Antonio Conte's quotes that a lot of people thought were really toxic, at the time. I don't think Ange's are really that different. It's kind of a very sort of headliney type of quote that will maybe come back to haunt you at the end of the day. And then also just recently, the one that I'm getting kind of a little bit frustrated with is when he says, my job is just to win football matches. But then he goes on to say that my job is to deliver, a certain style that, entertains the fans and is like, here to win, in a certain way that makes my dad proud and all that stuff. It's like, that's two contradictory things. Like either you're there to win football matches or you're there to build a project and build a sustainable way of playing that the fans will enjoy and will be proud of. You've heard him say both things. So I think with Ange, it's a mix of both. I think there have been times when the media has definitely been against him. Right now, in this moment, though, I agree with Simon. I think it's just he's losing a lot of games, and they kind of have to ask hard questions, of him, and he doesn't really do too well with the hard questions. He ends up kind of speaking too honestly, like I've just spoken about, or he just ends up kind of throwing out some very, definitive headline type of quote that just doesn't seem very necessary and ends up kind of, sort of hanging on with people and ends up being a bit of a gotcha moment for him. So I know that was a long rant, Sam, but I think it is a bit of both. I think there have been times when definitely media agenda for sure. But right now, I mean, yes, the injuries, do get ignored, but he is losing a lot of games. Like they have to ask hard questions, and he doesn't do well with these hard questions, in my opinion.
I think um, the overarching kind of thing that you have to kind of bear in mind, and I'm not saying that you don't, I'm just kind of saying is that Ange is a human being, right? He's just a normal guy, and I think that that is evident in a lot of what you've said in his honesty and he's not been brought up in this play the game kind of situation where you've got to speak in riddles and blah blah blah. He's just very cut the shit, straight talking. This is me. I am who I am, right? And I think that that goes to. I kind of disagree with you a little bit about the comments about I always win something in my second season. And I think that he also like sort of went explained that comment a bit further when someone asked him about it before, sorry, afterwards, which was he basically said, like, I'm not saying I'm going to win in my second season. I'm merely stating a fact. I have won in every second season I've ever had, which is kind of how I took the comment. Um, he wasn't basically saying, like "f you," like I'm the best. I think it was just basically like, look at my track record, give me the respect and the maybe even the time to go out there and show you that I can and have won trophies in my second season.
Hmm.
Um, I think that when you look at these gotcha moments, they're very like Twitter sphere esque, right? It's like when you're looking through comments on posts and you see rival fans like I see all these Arsenal people being like, "This is what Haaland meant," and then posting photos of like Jude Bellingham doing his celebrations and whatever, like just basically trying to one up each other every time something goes on. And I think that the media is guilty of getting bogged down in all this bullshit, basically.
Mm.
Um, I mean, like I always think about when Unai Emery got sacked from Arsenal, right? And look, I'm not gonna sit here and say I didn't chuckle to myself every time he said good evening, right? But he gets sacked and he says good evening, and he's not a native English speaker, it's his second language. But the interviewer showed a real lack of class and says, "Well, Unai, it's not a good evening, is it?" And it's like
Yeah.
you're doing this for clicks, and I think that a lot of the stuff is being done for clicks, and there is, in my opinion, malicious intent behind a lot of things that are being phrased. And I think that Ange is kind of realizing, maybe it's not even the football side of it that's really getting him down or like appearing to get him down. I think it's genuinely the interactions he's having outside the club. And to sort of go back to Simon Jordan, and this is not necessarily to like excuse him, because as I've said, I've criticized Klopp for some of the stuff that Ange has kind of done recently or in the last few months. When you're in a position like this, you're losing a lot of games, and there doesn't really seem to be a light at the end of the tunnel. And like you said, every time I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel, it is an oncoming train. Um, you have to create a them versus us mentality, and I think that we can see that by the way that he's always like, basically, "I'll die on my sword. Don't come and at the players. I'll take the brunt of this." And I think that ultimately is what is keeping him in the job, because whether or not you think the players are playing for him, I think that they will respect him because he is shielding them from the shit. And I mean, look,
Mm.
that might ultimately end up being his downfall, because there'll be players in there. We've seen that before in other teams, not even just Spurs, where these players take that sort of thing for granted and they
Yeah.
think that they're untouchable because the manager is effectively cutting his nose to spite his face in order to protect the rest of the players. But I think ultimately, when Ange does get snappy, it's difficult for him when I've listened to a few of these these press conferences he's done, and ultimately I can't listen to them anymore because he genuinely does get asked the same question over and
Yeah.
over and over again.
Yeah.
And it's like you can see him getting more and more frustrated because he's answered the question about injuries. And then the next person's like, "So Ange, just on that injuries thing you just said," then he'll answer that. And then the next person will ask about the first part of the question that he's already answered, and it just goes round and around and around. And it's
Yeah.
you listen to Ali Gold talking about, he's often the one that asks a lot of questions because either people don't have anything else to ask Ange other than injury stuff, or why you're losing, um, and you kind of have to kind of you don't want to lose the manager from in a press conference point of view if you're a journalist. So there has to be some sort of give and take. Um, I think ultimately, yes, Ange has been snappy. Do I love it? No. Do I respect it? Yes, because he is just standing up for what he believes, and I think that ultimately, like Simon Jordan's paid to overanalyze these kind of things, and let's be honest, he's a bit of a shithouse as well. They all are on TalkSport, and I and I like it. I like TalkSport because of that. But obviously, when it's directed at you, it's easier to kind of take more of an offense at
Mm.
that. But I think that he's just doing it, for the sake of it. And maybe there are some questions about, I see a lot of people saying him and Levy have a decent relationship. So is he again helping Levy out by piling pressure onto Ange, who's already struggling to stay afloat, and sort of
That's a
deflecting
good
away
theory.
from Levy? Who knows?
That's a good theory to end with there. That's actually very funny. I didn't think about it that way. I was actually surprised by it because only just 2 weeks ago, right, we did a video saying Simon Jordan backs Ange Postecoglou, and now all of a sudden, he's saying, he's opening a can of worms on himself. I agree with your explanation. I think Ange is definitely hard done by the journalists plenty of times. But I do think he does, sometimes maybe, give them, plenty of morsels to feed on, if you want to put it that way. Um,
Sure.
but everybody, smash the like button. Follow Sam on Twitter, please. Spurs Undercover. And hopefully, see you later for some more content. And our big Dave Harris will be back. And if you are watching this Thursday, we will be doing a recording with Change for Tottenham. So look out for that. And that should be definitely something worth your time. So please, everybody, check that out. We'll see you next time. Come on, you Spurs.